this really special interview that we have today, and then share a little bit about our guest speaker. So a little bit about our guest today. Cecil Cook is an educator, social anthropologist, institution builder, technology designer, and practitioner. He graduated with an MA in social anthropology in 1969 at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. For over 50 years, he's been involved in the development and planning of cross-cultural research, interpretation and mediation, cost-benefit assessments of competing technologies, hands-on training and technologies appropriate for developing communities, creating low-cost sustainable development based on renewable energy, utilization water, wind, sun, and biomass, permaculture-based agricultures and economies, innovative whole system design, and implementation of small-scale farming. So really full background there, Cecil. I'm so excited to talk with you today. So our first question is, what is, in your point of view, what is appropriate technology, and how would you describe how would you describe an appropriate technology?
Okay, it's a big topic, but I was influenced quite a bit in the let's see which decade it was, in probably the 70s of the last century, by Fritz Schumacher, E.F. Schumacher, who wrote a book that got quite a bit of attention. It was the title of the book was "Small is Beautiful," and he started, and he was much influenced by Mahatma Gandhi, and I guess his professional position was he was the chief economist for the British Coal Board, and in this book he basically applies Gandhian economics to European societies and the U.S. and other places in the world to differentiate between those technologies that are going to be somehow on balance, uplifting and beneficial. He would make a joke that when he was describing economists, he says that we are the people that make a living rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So, and then he would get a good laugh out of that. And I helped to introduce. I mean, I helped to create something, or did some of the planning work, and served on the first board of the National Center for Appropriate Technology in Butte, Montana, which was financed through a kind of political route by Mike Mansfield, who was the Speaker of the House and who wanted to do something in Butte, Montana, which was falling into a open-face copper mine that was sort of devouring the town. And he thought that if appropriate technology would be used, it was in fact going to do something useful, practical, it would be good to locate it there. And he arranged a $3 million startup fund for this appropriate technology program. And then I ended up, I did with another guy, Eugene Eckley, the sort of the first plan, the feasibility study of starting it. And then I resigned as a consultant from the process and ended up being invited to serve on the board of directors. And so that was where I sort of cut my teeth and discovered all of the pressures that interfere the fact that people have very different interests, and so actually finding points of unity or agreement between all of the different interest groups that were represented on the board of directors of this National Center for Appropriate Technology was very difficult, almost impossible, because there were the women were asserting themselves, and the corporate interest groups or big companies were asserting themselves through their representatives, and the African Americans were asserting themselves, and the Hispanics were asserting themselves, and this is back in the early 70s, actually. And so that was, and so the upshot of it was that the alliances, between different interest groups really politicized all of the discussion about what is in fact an appropriate technology. And so that's the interest, and it proved devilishly complicated to get agreement between all of these different interest groups who had very different visions of a more perfect America and how to build it. So that's and I approached this problem more from the perspective of how did we find our way, to some kind of working agreement between all of the interest groups. I mean, I was a relatively recent Baha'i, and so I was also sort of just exploring how we could move this whole process of consultation to a more positive conclusion. So that's my what just to go back to India and Mahatma Gandhi, he created something, or Nehru did, to honor Gandhi's role in the liberation of India. They created a Khadi Village Industries Association, which identified about 400 different products which were reserved for a percentage or a proportion of those products, like matches and soap and cement and timber and food and so on, and clothing, for production by village industries. And so it was a top-down redistribution, or an attempt at top-down redistribution of production that would somehow minimize the urbanization of industry, and it would decentralize industry in India. And it ultimately failed because Nehru was under the spell of the Soviet or Russian approach, big industry approach, and he simply sort of honored the memory of Gandhi, but the real thrust of Indian development was always focused around strengthening the big institutions in the cities. So that's sort of my background on that.
Okay. So with that first example that you mentioned, in Butte, which I've been there briefly before, and saw the kind of like place basically where it was the coal factory where it was no longer operating, but it sure leaves a historical mark on the town. So my question for you about that example that you brought up, which must have been right shortly after you graduated Harvard, when you were involved, it sounded like you had quite a diverse representation, which this day and age, you think that's a positive thing, right? And women involved, you said Hispanics, Latinos, African Americans. So what do you think? Do you think society just wasn't like the consultative process? You brought up consultation, that you were trying to bring, you were trying to bring consultation maybe to a better point. What was the issue there, and how does that connect to creating, I guess, identifying appropriate technologies? How does that connect to that in a diverse group? I hope my question was clear.
No, I understand the question. It's that we didn't trust, I mean, the different interests represented on the board of directors of NCAT, the National Center for Appropriate Technology. We didn't really trust each other. I mean, for instance, there was also Robert Redford's wife was the sort of celebrity person serving on the board, she was on the planning committee, and so that the political or sort of secular interests and priorities of the Black liberation sort of movement and Hispanic movement for equal rights, and the people from General Electric and several of the other big companies that served on the planning committee, and ultimately a few of them were serving on the board of directors, that they wanted, I mean, it was just like the kind of paralysis that I think we're in the United States now, that we've divided, reality up into parts, and we've lost the ability to put, Humpty Dumpty back together again. And so that was, I think, what happened to the board of directors, that we basically got, we couldn't manage our own diversity. And as a result, we were not in a high enough consciousness to be able to do that. And eventually I left in utter disappointment, and then decided, I was recruited to go to South Africa and try again. And so that's what I did in South Africa.
So it sounds like, I mean, I heard trust in there, that's an important element that was lacking, an important element of identifying appropriate technologies. And also, I mean, yeah, just the ability to consult together in a diverse group, right? And that's really interesting that you mentioned those things. Have you heard of the one laptop per child program?
Mm-mm.
So it was an initiative that that basically, so it illustrates the failure to harmonize means and ends. So while technological innovation allowed laptops, it was a project where they gave laptops they had laptops be produced for more than just a little over $200 per laptop.
I know. I'm remembering this one. Yeah.
Okay. So they had, a really grand objective to distribute, I can't remember how many laptops it was, but it was in the millions, right? But little or no effort was made to develop pedagogical material utilizing the laptops, the technology. And there was some initial surveys from Peru where the laptops were distributed in schools, and it indicated that no improvement had been made in educational performance by students. apart from learning how to use the laptops. So critics contend that the funds used for the laptops would have been better applied to teacher training. So just with that interesting example in mind, there was a lot of money lost because countries that they thought would invest in this technology were really, they didn't know what the outcomes would be, right? So they weren't willing to put, millions of dollars for this, or even hundreds of thousands of dollars for this, because they just really didn't have the money and didn't know that it was going to make a difference. So, and also, yeah, looking at training. So I guess I have a question for you. How can we implement appropriate technologies into community development projects and educational systems with this, like, I guess, example of a failure of that in mind?
Okay, I'm thinking. I can give you an example of how in the Transkei, it's a province, it's part of the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, how we managed to create some culture buy-in or some cultural foundation or some almost a cultural clothing for different or new technologies. I can give you some examples of that. And
that'd be great. Yeah. That's perfect.
Okay, so what we did is, and I actually had quite a bit of money, apartheid money, because the apartheid government, Afrikaners are geniuses at doing the right thing for the wrong reason. And because they were desperate to create some kind of a homegrown economy in their Bantustans. And so they were willing to sort of experiment, and they invested millions of dollars in the startup of it's called TATU, Transkei Appropriate Technology Unit. And so, and that it allowed me to assemble a multicultural staff of people with education, professional backgrounds, and then to bring several of the, or to demonstrate the potential benefits of a number of simple technologies that could be introduced into the villages of the Transkei. And so now what we would do is we had trailers, and we would just we'd have a dog and pony show, and we'd introduce people to better stoves that could be made out of clay bricks, and we would introduce them to hydraulic ram pumps, and we would introduce them to little machines that would allow them to make something. There's an echo. Anyway, that would allow them to make fence from spools of wire. And so we would show these technologies, and then we would come back and we would have community meetings with the entire village. And what we would do is we would invite the village to decide what was their number one problem. And then they would go into a day-long meeting in the hot sun, and to argue about whether it was the road, or whether it was a water supply, or whether it was sort of irrigation for agriculture, or whether it was school construction. And so they would, and then they would, often it was managed by the school committee.
Okay.
And then we would have, and in that process, it was a very patriarchal society, and the men dominated the whole discussion process. But then the men exhausted themselves, and they got into sort of stalemates, and the women gradually asserted their presence and their preferences, and in the end, the decisions about what is the number one problem of village after village was determined by the women. So they were the balance of power. And so then once we'd gotten identified the number one problem in a particular village, then we would go through a planning process, and it was sometimes school classroom construction, and we did it in such a way that, or it would be water supply, or improving the quality of the water and then we had developed a simple technology of just spring development, and so we would isolate the springs and create ways. We would fence them, and we would divert the rainwater runoff, and then we would cap them and take the water to a ferrocement tank, and then we would run it downhill to a tap. So that way we would increase the water supply greatly, because you had the 24-hour-a-day flow of the spring going into a tank, and the cost of that was, like, in those days, about under $10 per beneficiary. So that would be an example, and then they would form a committee, and then we would work together to introduce that and many other technologies. We did road development, and we also did classroom construction. But the point, I guess, is that we would not finance it all. We required the first step of a committee that had been, when a committee had been formed to undertake such any project based on this sort of democratic process. The committee would then, we would ask the committee to assess the taxpayers, how many taxpayers were there in that village, and then they would negotiate about how much could the taxpayers contribute to the project. So we started all of the projects with a self-help contribution, and so from that we had a kind of buy-in, and then we did thousands of projects. There were like 50, I think, let me see if I can remember, about 5,000 villages in the Transkei, and we worked probably in about 1,000 of them, and we did many different projects. The tragedy is that when the ANC came back into power, they pretty much vetoed the whole self-help project, because they said, no, the people are poor, we need to pay them to do this work. And then once that was that change was introduced, then they used government funding to create tenders, and then businessmen, small business people from the towns took responsibility for doing this work, and everybody expected to be paid, and the cost skyrocketed, and that was the end of local initiative. And so it was a very sad experience.
So that's really interesting that you bring that up, because one of the things I was going to ask is what makes a technology inappropriate. And to me, like, this involvement of politics, this involvement of self-interest and, capital self-interest, to me is where I think this is, you mentioned a few examples of political, this kind of involvement kind of making things turn. Yeah, were there any other examples of, like, I mean, it seems like you were coming from a place, your work, where you had all this knowledge about what makes it technology appropriate, and all these best case examples, and you kind of were like ahead of the game in this sense that you were already helping to use these best practices in practice. So yeah, is there anything else that kind of caused these projects to go awry that that you want to share?
Yeah, I can give you an example of where a technology that actually got out of control, and that was adopted by the people, and it just became an indigenous technology. So, and what happened was a Baha'i that I worked with, Crispin Pemberton Pickett, a Canadian Baha'i, who in fact recruited me. I was working for the Peace Corps in South America, in Ecuador, and he found me in a pension in Ecuador, and then invited me to come to South Africa to do this project of sort of demonstrating the value of an appropriate technology approach to rural development. And he were together. But he did the technical work. He developed it's not a hydraulic, it's a mechanical press to make soil cement bricks to compress soil with about maybe 2 or 3% cement and into bricks. And so we used that, and it became known as the Tatu brickmaker. And we used it as the entree to any school construction project, because the people of the village had to make enough bricks for us to build however many classrooms they wanted, and we would train them in how to do that. And so as a result, that technology just became well established, and the brickmaking machine was called the Tatu brickmaker. And so now when after the apartheid system was collapsing or collapsed, and people could move wherever they wanted, there was a flood of people moving into the cities, and the capital of the Transkei was Umtata, and thousands of people flooded in looking for work and just education and things that they didn't have in the village. And so there were big townships that grew up all around the dairy, the old dairy farm where we had established the Tatu as an organization. And what happened is that metal workers had reverse engineered this Tatu brickmaker, which was actually being made by a Baha'i company in Swaziland, and they began to make it themselves in their own workshops, and they were being sold in the building supply outlets in the city, and they were sold at about the same price as we could buy them from the Swaziland company. It was called Nudon Engineering, and you can actually, if you Google that site, they're not producing anymore, but they have a very complete list of products that were developed and were originally made through this company in Swaziland. Anyway, what happened in these 4 townships around Umtata, one of them was called Joe Slovo, and another one was called Mandela. Mandela Park, and another one was named after another hero of the revolution. Anyway, that women basically adopted that approach to making bricks, and they would come to a site with a wheelbarrow. The machine was heavy, but you could move it with a wheelbarrow, and they would bring bags of cement on their heads, and they would come as a team, and they would make bricks for people's houses. And the advantage of that technology is it didn't require much water, and they used the soil that was on site, and so they became the contract team that would make the bricks that people needed, and so dozens of these women led businesses, self-help businesses, were established in these, and over a period of about maybe 15 years or 20 years, more than 50% of the houses were built using these so-called tattoo blocks. And so that's a good indication that the technology was right. It was spontaneously adapted, and it was uncontrollable.
Wow.
So, and I mean, and in fact, I think Abbie Hoffman had a book that he wrote. Remember back in the days of the yippies, steal this book. I mean, the fact that the technology is somehow appropriate is that people steal it. And in fact, that's what I found. I did a study for USAID on the difference between spontaneous technology adaptation and imposed technology adaptation. And what I discovered is that almost all of the major innovations in agriculture in many of the countries in Africa all went back to missionary stations where people were able to, they weren't forced to do anything. They would steal anything that they saw that was being used by the missionaries in their farming operations, whether it was crops or tools or plows or whatever. They would actually take it home, and so that it became obvious to me that the harder you have to push a technology to be accepted or used, that creates resistance to its adoption, and that the introduction of many new things. I mean, just for goodness sake, think of how quickly the cell phone has permeated the third world markets, and that's another example. Anyway, that's a story.
That's really interesting, and that's interesting. I never thought about that before. The idea that, you know, when a technology really works, it might be stolen and adapted. And I mean, we see this in you know, Android versus Mac, and we have, you know, so many people or so many companies then developing further technology for Android. You'd say, is it stolen, or are we building upon knowledge, right? It's the same with music too. It's like when music is good music, it might be adopted and created and made into more different music, but using a similar kind of pattern, I guess. But yeah, I never kind of like thought about that before that you mentioned that it was stolen.
Yeah, and just on that point, Trotsky and also Thorstein Veblen, they had a theory about technology transfer, and it was, I think Thorstein Veblen was an economist, American economist in the last century. He came up with the idea of the advantage of backwardness. So that a good example of that is what happened to rail transport in the UK and in Germany. So that by the time the rail transport system had been sort of fully developed in the UK was littered with rails of different size and wheels of different sizes. And so that when you came to the end of one track size, they had to lift the cars up and then put new other wheels on them. And so it was a very fragmented system. And when Bismarck decided to build a national rail system in Germany, about 75 or 80, maybe even 100 years later, he made use of all of that development, and he actually standardized the German railway system, and that was really one of the main ingredients for the nationalization or the creation of a very efficient national economy in Germany. So that's an advantage of backwardness. So that in the long run, these inequities somehow work themselves out. Possibly. Okay.
I wanted to share a quote from Dr. Arbab that you mentioned before, Farzam Arbab, who is a Baha'i, anyone that's maybe never heard of him before. And he created this, or he founded this organization, Fundayak, that's an educational organization that's now international, that started in Colombia. But he said a simple working technology may be quite inappropriate if it leads to stagnation, and a complex one is appropriate if it is accompanied by learning, so that the people can assume complete control and be able to deal with the changes that their technological choice will bring to social structures and relationships.
Where does he say that? I'm not challenging it. I just would like to know.
No, yeah, that's from Fundayak. It's Principles and Activities.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good.
Well, yeah, I mean, it reminds me of the examples that you brought up of the women adopting
the tattoo brickmaker, yes.
Tattoo brickmaker, yeah. And they assumed, like what you said, complete control, and we're taking it and running. Yeah. Do you have any other thoughts about?
The other thing about that, the women, the way they made money is they would brew beer, and which that was a technology that they controlled, and they would turn their homes into shebeens, or little saloons, and then they would get money from the men by selling them beer, and that brought all kinds of other problems into their lives. So they were choosing to make bricks rather than to make beer. They applied the same sort of ingenuity and self-help principle that they used with making beer to making bricks. So, but it was less problematic. I mean, drunk men, are a pain in the backside.
So they were previously brewing the beer, and then they transitioned once this technology was introduced.
Yeah, they moved the organization, the cooperation, just the business expertise that they had developed around shebeens to making bricks.
So that's interesting, because I feel like you just brought up an inappropriate technology is the beer making, but yeah, but why it caused societal breakdown, I guess. Do you have any other, in your experiences in South Africa? It sounds like I didn't even read in your background that you had been to Ecuador and in the Peace Corps That's so interesting too. I lived in Ecuador. But from your experiences in Butte, South Africa, Ecuador, do you have any other examples of appropriate technologies that you worked on?
Well, the one that was the spring development that we did, which was it was so cheap, so that we could guarantee a secure supply of drinkable or not treated but relatively pure water to a village through its own initiative and its own labor power, and then those were very well received and popular by villages. They would often choose that as their number one problem. And the difficulty was that the government of the Transkei was through the rural engineering branch had another approach, which was to build really high-tech integrated rural water supply systems, which were extremely expensive, in excess of $300 per beneficiary in those days. And and then it created a big conflict between TATU, the Transkei Appropriate Technology Unit, and the sort of professional engineer-led Department of Agriculture, the rural engineering branch of the Department of Agriculture. And this is actually quite a delicate story I'm going to share. There were two brothers from Iran who were in charge of the rural engineering branch of the Department of Agriculture's and they were the controllers or the managers of the rural water supply program. And so as a result, I found myself in open conflict with my Baha'i brothers about what was the most appropriate way to supply water to these 5,000 villages in the Transkei. And so I managed to determine that their costs were so great that in fact the backlog for improved water systems was growing every year. And then we would meet at budget time and we would present our different approaches. And it became very tense for me because I felt, I mean, as an American, that if you have a disagreement with someone, you need to just struggle with each other and go through a struggle session and learn from each other. And there was not much room for that to happen in the Baha'i community. It was divisive, and I would wake up at night having nightmares about the children that were dying from drinking bad water, from gastroenteritis or whatever. They were actually drinking water that was being trampled in by pigs and goats and chickens and so on. And I felt somehow personally culpable for not being able to resolve that situation. And I really got very upset with my Baha'i brothers, the engineers who were running this really expensive engineer dependent approach to integrated rural water supply. So what happened is that I had even trouble going to feasts with them because I felt that I should it was inauthentic for me to be friendly to them when we were engaged in such a life and death struggle of what was the most appropriate approach to supplying the water needs of a vast population. And so at one of the feasts, I don't know quite how it happened, but I think my heart was changed, and I realized that how precious was the opportunity, because they remained very sweet in their the way they related to me, and I was struggling inwardly with the fact that I was so angry with them, that that I thought as a good American person, I should show them I should honor them by disagreeing as civilly as I could, but that I had a responsibility to actually be as truthful as I could with them. And so my heart was changed somehow, and I came to the conclusion that I needed to be that any opportunity for unity was more important, was more beautiful, was more precious than my speaking my truth to them. And so I managed to overcome my own anger and my wretchedness about that. And so help me, like 6 weeks later, they changed all of the policies of their organization to adopt the village-centered, small-scale, low-cost approach. And there was never any discussion about it. Nobody ever said, "Well, thank you, we've learned," but there was no need for discussion. And so that was the reward. That I was the obstacle. My anger was the obstacle. So anyway, that's a story.
Wow. Thank you. That is such a powerful story. It sounds like unity of thought is a really powerful ingredient in terms of things really moving forward appropriately with technology. And it's interesting. One question I was going to ask is, how is so looking at learning, and that quote that Dr. Arbad mentioned, it's accompanied by learning so that people can assume complete control and be able to deal with changes. So from your point of view, how is the generation, application, and dissemination of knowledge linked to development of appropriate technologies?
Farzam Arbab was, as I read his life, and was involved in a sort of a lifelong struggle with the liberation theology, theologians in Latin America, and also with Paulo Freire, the pedagogy of the oppressed. And so he was addressing those issues, the kind of Marxist materialistic approach or understanding of how priorities get set. And you remember that Freire said that the only way that Brazilian peasants who had been traumatized by the class system could really learn to read and have the self-confidence to become literate was that they had to actually face the traumas of the class system. And Fanon actually goes so far as to say you have to kill the oppressor symbolically. So, what I have great respect for Farzam Arbab, because when he was studying at, I don't know, he was, I think, studying at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And I think he had some connections or some conversations with Dan Jordan and Dwight Allen at the Department of Education there. He organized on his own authority or his own, with his own just with a, just based on questions he was searching to answer, he organized a consultation between the Baha'i, and it was billed or advertised as a consultation between the Baha'i faith and Marxism. And then there's a book that it's a 3 or 4 essays, that one of which, or the lead one, was written by Farzam. And so Farzam had, I mean, he was not adverse. I mean, can you imagine if we tried to organize such a consultation through the administrative order today? It would be complicated to have that kind of. So he did it, and I have great respect for his example and what he did, and so that he basically, I think, and then then the work that his wife Sona Farid Arbab, she's written a very powerful book, Moral Empowerment, which actually, and I could hear Farzam Arbab's voice at many points in that book. So, and it's addressing how you create culture around, that means a moral culture around the any technical solution, how you basically ground an economy, and for that matter science and technology, in a framework of morality.
You mean culture, a moral culture, like human values, right?
Yes.
Reflecting these in the appropriate technologies.
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah.
Could you mention what was the name of that book again?
Which one? It's if you just go on Baha'i, whatever it is, BahaiLibrary.com, or I think it will. It's a consultation on Marxism, Baha'i faith and Marxism.
Okay. Interesting.
But he writes about it later in what is it? The Temple, the Lab, and the Market, which is also online now. You can get that. It's a PDF. You can download it. That's one of his major works. Is probably his major work.
Okay, so kind of jumping in on that topic of human values reflected in appropriate technologies, how do you see that appropriate technologies extend human capabilities?
Well,
so actually, let me preface that with some might say the sole purpose of technology is to develop our human capabilities and capacities, right?
To extend, yeah.
Okay, and to enable human ideals and aspirations to flourish. So, but similar to any tool, technology can be utilized in a constructive or destructive manner, right? And I didn't mention the example of like Silicon Valley right now. We're, it's maybe a very well-known example. So it's the center of today's technology boom. accounts for 1/3 of all the venture capital investment in the United States. But there's a great gap between rich and poor. And statistics show that the Bay Area's homeless population has risen significantly, as high as 35% in some counties. And there's a huge, drug problem right now with and they say that's connected to this issue. So I guess going back to what I just mentioned, it can be used in a constructive or destructive manner, right? So it can extend human capabilities, but it can also restrict human capabilities. And those are some kind of negative examples, but looking at it used in the other way, how can technology be used in a constructive manner to extend human capabilities?
I'm going to tell you a funny story. Bill Mollison, the guy that he didn't invent permaculture all by himself, but he was a major curator and popularizer of permaculture. And he came to Transky in the 1980s, about the middle of the 1980s. And he told me a story about a Baha'i in Los Angeles, in the black ghetto of Los Angeles, who had somehow he had a drug problem, and he was living on somebody's front porch in, I guess, in Watts, and he managed, and he began to get comfortable or have a relationship with some of the gangs, the street gangs in Watts. And then out of that process, this is Bill's story, which Bill would make up stories, but I think it is probably a bit true. And so that this Baha'i guy got into a relationship with some of the gangs and actually began to shape the sort of the rules of engagement of some of these gangs, and he was sort of leading them in another direction, and but all from living on somebody's front porch in Watts. So the question is then how do we sort of, where does the authority come that allows us to sort of reorganize our orientational culture, our fundamental culture? That's really, and it grows out of, I think, solidarity and familiarity and Ivan Illich wrote a very interesting book, which I don't know if how much I agree with it now, but it's called Tools for Conviviality. And it has to do with how people actually shape how they build a culture around their economy, how they humanize their economy. And I think so that and unfortunately, unless we have sources of authority that we that give us our sort of the dominant principles or objectives that we use, that we accept, that we serve, that we honor, and until we have that kind of foundation, it's actually very hard to strategize, and you don't. I mean, just like what happened to me in the Transky with the two Baha'i engineers from Iran, I could not get to an agreement with them using sort of secular language or secular technology assessments, because I could prove all of the things that I was saying, but it somehow did not create a bridge that allowed us to unify. We unified in the feast, where we accepted each other's inner and outer humanity somehow. So, and if we don't have that, that point of a sort of selfless reconciliation, selfless embrace of each other as humans, as fellow humans, as noble humans. I don't think, and so my technique was not the right technique, but I mean, that's one of the problems I have with spiritually awakened people trying to reshape or to create new world order outcomes through old world order organizations. There is definite limits on how far you can't force people. I had that problem. I was trying to force. I had 220 people working for me, and I was a sort of born again Baha'i, and I was using my power to force them to behave like Baha'is as much as I could through my authority, the money that I paid them, and so on, and my ability to punish them or discipline them if they didn't behave like a Baha'i or didn't honor the what I felt was the most important thing. And what I discovered is that in the end, you can't change people's inner consciousness through this kind of outer manipulation or outer imposition. You can't get new world order results out of old world order people. So that's.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, I think maybe our time has come to, it's been a little over an hour, and there's been so many I've been jotting notes. There's been so many interesting things I think the audience can learn. I've learned about your experiences. I just want to mention kind of a few that stood out to me. Of course, we didn't get to talk about diversity a whole lot, and the benefits maybe or disadvantages. But I did, so far, I've gleaned from a really rich conversation that one, the involvement of women was mentioned several times as being an enhancer to appropriate technology, or maybe the balance of the sexes. I think you mentioned unity a lot in terms of consultation. What was just mentioned is you use the words solidarity, familiarity, conviviality. That was beautiful. And unity of thought is really important here when we're talking about this topic. And you touched just now on the recognition of nobility of human beings. That's super key. And turning towards a central kind of like point of light or of knowledge. And I guess that goes back to unity of thought. You also, I don't know if you directly mentioned this, but openness, I kind of gleaned from, being open and transparency. And we talked a little bit about diversity a few times with the different examples you mentioned. But yeah, maybe we can end with that. Your thoughts on how can diversity be incorporated when developing appropriate technology?
Let me tell you just a quick story. Among the Xhosa people in the Eastern Cape, it's an insult for a younger person to stare directly into the eyes of an older person, an elder. And since I was much older than many of my staff, I had to get used to them coming into my office and then not looking at me and having a conversation with me. So they had to stare down or over my shoulder, or they couldn't look directly in my eyes. And so culturally, a person that is shifty-eyed, for me, is not very believable, or he's up to something. And so I understood the culture because I had to learn how to talk with eyes. And I once gave a talk about appropriate technology to a group of women just in the first weeks that I had arrived in the Transkei, and I gave a little summary, thumbnail sketch of what I was there to do, and and anyway, it ended, and I went back to my office, and there was also a woman that was there with me, and I said, "My God, I totally missed them. Nobody responded to what I was sharing." And she said to me with a big smile on her face, "What are you talking about? They loved it." I couldn't read the eyes. And so I've learned to read the eyes. And I've been in Africa for mostly with the Xhosa people for 40, 50 years. And now when I'm in the US and I get disoriented or lost and I look around for support, or the only eyes that I can find are African American eyes. So I draw great comfort from those eyes, and I feel actually uneasy when I'm in a group that doesn't have some of my African brothers and sisters around
me. Wow.
So,
well, thank you, Cecil. I don't know if you had any other thoughts. That was a really neat way to end the interview.
No, as I said, dear, the questions that you were operating from, each of them is almost a small book.
Yeah, for sure.
Themselves, yeah.
And you have so much to share. Oh my goodness. I think this could be a part 1 of 4 interviews with Cecil Cook.
Okay. Well.
So